everybody, this is Jackie Luqman.
And I'm Luqman.
And welcome to Live in Luqman Nation. As always, we're dealing with technical issues, but this is what happens when you are on a shoestring, and we apologize for that. But we are Luqman Nation. And we absolutely, as always, want to talk we're about dealing with technical issues, but this is what happens when you are so on a shoestring. Important. And we apologize for that. To so many, we are Luqman Nation. Absolutely, as always, want to. I have to start with technical issues. What happens when you are so on a shoestring? And we apologize for that. Really so many, we are Luqman Nation. Absolutely, as always, it's because as I see, I have so many progressives who what happens when you are so on a shoestring are very new, and we apologize for that. Really so we are Luqman Nation. Absolutely, it's because as I see, I have so many progressives and politics how they're very new, and we apologize for that. So we are Luqman Nation. There's no better way to put it. But it's because as I see, I have so many progressives and politics that are going on shattering figures in the background, pulling fights and doing all of my various things on a grand scale, and as if all that are going on in shattering figures in the background, all this time, Bernie Sanders just revealed all this. On a grand scale, we're going to talk about tonight, as if all those issues that really ought to stop Bernie Sanders. Because there has not been some large, shadowy Illuminati or George Soros like or Rothschild like entities all of the strange in our government. Our government has been eroding the alleged Soros like in this country that they claim to have through policies and practices in our government very has been eroding the reason we are at the point we are on the precipice of I don't know what we want to call it, revolution, tyranny, chaos, anarchy, collapse of empire, but whatever we're on the precipice of, what brought us to this point are the kinds of policies that we're going to talk about today. Not a shadowy, filthy rich figure with a nefarious, underhanded plan. Not the Rothschilds, not the Illuminati, not the elite, not the establishment, but plain old, filthy rich figure with capitalistic greed that's fueled by racism. Not the Rothschilds, not the Illuminati. See, these are the issues, not the elite we talk about. These are the stories we highlight. These are the reasons why we fight. Hashtag why we fight. Not to dispute or expose some grand conspiracy, not to point out false flags, not to declare a major event a distraction to larger issues, but to focus on the actual issue that have been in place or exposed some grand conspiracy, not to point out false flags. So tonight we're going to start a discussion about the war on the poor. And this has come from something that we see all the time. Or live in a neighborhood that's some a very poor area in our city, even though we're kind of middle class. So tonight we're going to start a discussion. And this also came from discussions that we have had with well-meaning white progressives and middle class black people who live in a neighborhood that's poor, who feel that there are these piecemeal lifestyle behavior kind of changes that poor people can make to improve their lives. Well, the beginning of this conversation tonight, we hope, is going to start to dispel that notion that poor people can make any change in their individual behavior, lifestyle behavior that can improve their situation. No, what we need to do is address the policies and the practices that not only create and perpetuate the poverty, but criminalize that poor people can make any change in their individual behavior, lifestyle that can improve their situation. No, what we need to do, let's see. Let us know if that's better, you guys.
So there's a loop. There's something running in the background. It's a loop.
Okay. Give it a sec. Give it a couple of seconds, and let's
Oh,
see if
George
that.
said, "Oh, it's going now."
Okay.
All
Great.
right, there we go.
Wonderful. All right. And you can see how unhappy Mr. Luqman was.
They say I'm unhappy even when I'm not unhappy.
He's just got that kind of face.
Yep.
Sometimes he's really not that angry. So all right, so we went to Richmond.
Mm-hmm.
What's today? Friday. We were in Richmond Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Tuesday night.
Yep.
And we were participating in the March for Accountability Tuesday night in Richmond with our friends, the Virginia Defenders, Phil Willeto and Anna Edwards. Hello, you guys. Thank you all so much for welcoming us and allowing us to support you. We really appreciate that. And what people in Richmond are facing, because people have the mistaken idea that people in Richmond are only focusing on taking down the statues, the Confederate statues. That's not the only part of the issue. So let me show you a clip from some of the issues that they're really facing in Richmond.
We're letting people determine who our enemies are and who our enemies are not. So I'm going to go back to this computation real quick because I want us to really get that. 220,000 people make up the city of Richmond. Public housing is 4,100 units. So the poverty rate is 26%. So taking the 26%, that's 57 plus thousand people by the city numbers that they say live in abject poverty. 41 fixed units in public housing is 11 point some thousand people. So bumping it up to 60,000 and 15,000 that's in public housing for ease of math. Subtract the 15 from the 60 and you have 40 plus thousand people by the city numbers and the definition of who actually live in public housing that do not that are in the poverty category that do not definition of who and this is information that we really need to start addressing to our city council people that are in the poverty category that do not definition of who and this is information that we really need to start addressing to our city council people that are in the poverty it's not something it's not giving us information of who actually I want to live start addressing to our city council people that as we go forward, we can have the real conversation about what's actually happening in our community. Thank you very much. Also, we can see that it's time to rain. We can.
So, aside from the statistics that she gave, that was a housing advocate in Richmond that was at a rally that was held after the march in Richmond on Tuesday night, where they had several speakers come and talk about the individual issues, the specific issues that people in Richmond are fighting to correct, are fighting to get the city council to correct. Issues like the lack of affordable housing for poor people and the excessive number of people who need affordable housing, even though the city doesn't pay attention to its own numbers, right? So we brought you that information from Richmond as an example of the kind of stuff that we like to cover here in Luqman Nation. Everybody's focusing on the DNC lawsuit, right? Everybody's talking about Seth Rich. Everybody's talking about, all of this other stuff. But nobody's really talking about what people are doing on the ground in their communities at the grassroots level. And this is why it's important. Because the kinds of things that are going on in Richmond, where we had another gentleman later on that night talking about how the police were towing people's cars if they were parked, if they had felt like they had a reason to run the tags and the registration on the cars, and the person the car was registered to was not a tenant, a person who was on the records
Right.
in public housing, that person's car was towed. Now we're talking about people who are already poor, who already are having a hard time to find somewhere to live, and they may be staying with friends or family in public housing. And what happens to them? Their only mode of transportation is taken away from them by the city, and the city is intentionally doing that.
Yeah, but I mean, but that's just what happens, right? I mean, you criminalize. I mean, poverty is criminalized in this country.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I was really disturbed to hear that that Richmond Police Department went as far as really lurking around the housing projects. Now, mind you, now when we started off with the video, the lady said that there's 220,000 people living in Richmond. Out of those 220,000 people, the poverty rate is 26%.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not a mathematician. I don't know what numbers that is. But she also stated that in Richmond they have 4,100 public housing units available, and they're not planning on building any more.
Uh-huh.
So if you have a poverty rate of 26%, you know, those people got to go somewhere. And every time Jackie and I went to Richmond, we've seen a lot of homeless people.
Yeah.
I mean, we've witnessed a lot of homeless people all over Richmond when we were down there. And they're just not black homeless. There's white homeless, young, old. I mean, they really do have a homeless population problem down there.
Yeah.
And so once again, you know, like, it's not so much to say, well, what you know, it's not to say, well, what can we do to make this better? No, it's like, well, how can we make their lives more miserable? And Jackie, as you stated, it's like now you have police who should be out doing something else. You know,
Right.
Richmond has has an uptick in violent crime right now.
Uh-huh.
You know, they have a murder rate that spiked, and you take police resources that should be moved towards trying to deal with that problem, but then you take those police resources and you go around making law-abiding poor people's lives more miserable.
Right.
So now look. Any of us who ever got our cars towed before know the game you got to play with the towing yard. You know, you leave it in there, you go in there, you're basically at the mercy of these people. So now you're talking about poor people who most are living on minimum wage and can't even afford a place to stay, and yet they have maybe their only mode of transportation to get back and forth to work is taken by the police because they're not on the lease. And we've seen this criminalization of poor people in public housing going back on the war on drugs. So, I mean, you know, we could take this even further back, that whole families were basically kicked out of public housing because somebody got arrested for selling drugs.
Right.
You know, and even after that person went to prison and served their time and supposedly paid their debt to society, they can't even move back home.
Right.
We're dealing with that crisis right now in D.C. To the point where in D.C. it's different. It's not a state. So you have people who are locked up in federal institutions all across this country because D.C. doesn't have a state penitentiary system.
Right.
So they're locked up in the federal penitentiary system all over, and some of them so far away their families can't get to them. And then when they're done their time, they can't even return back to the same housing units that they left, or sometimes the same neighborhood that they left, because of these draconian drug laws that are still on the books.
Right.
So when we start talking about poverty in this country, it is always that the poor people, their movements, what they do to try to survive, is always criminalized. Whether we've seen this with some of the police brutality cases of people losing their lives because they were selling bootleg CDs and you know, and were accused of selling cigarettes and all of this stuff to try to make a living in a capitalist society where you can't live for free. You know, you can't live for free. So now people do what they got to do to survive. And then what happens is because just like the mafia, the state's not getting their piece. They're not wetting their beak per se, old Sicilian term. Then and so now what happens is that these encounters now, where the state is used as revenue collectors, or just like the mob again. They're goons that come, and if you ain't got the boss's money, then they break your legs.
Right.
But in our cases, it's people's lives who are being lost, and there's no advocacy. Jackie, I think there was, when we was at that rally, someone has stated, and this is another reason about, you guys talk about the DNC lawsuit. DNC long outlived their usefulness when it comes to poor people, especially poor people of color. They long outlived their usefulness. Why I say that? Because this whole time that we were down there, someone had mentioned. Now, Jackie and I don't live in Richmond, but we can understand, because where we live, we see the same thing.
Right.
And what happened is someone had stated that black community's been voting Democratic, the Democratic Party, for decades. And just so we don't make this a racial thing, a lot of the council members in Richmond are black Democrats. Yet they did not vote to remove the statue, nor did they come down to support these people down the Shackled Bottom.
Right.
Not one politician with a D behind them came down there to support these people. They didn't do it. Yet, black people, people of color, have been voting for these people for decades. And I think it's time that we started to wake up and abandon them, because they long outlived their usefulness.
Yeah, I agree. And we're not saying that to give Republicans any fuel, because we always have to make that clear. In recognizing that the Democratic Party has outlived its usefulness to us decades ago. See, everybody talking about how corrupt the DNC is now. Y'all are so late to this game. We have been talking about how the Democrats have not served our needs and interests for years, but you didn't listen to us because your response was, well, at least they're not Republicans. Obviously, the Republicans are not any better, because no Republicans came down to march with us either. Okay, nobody who was a Republican, nobody on the Richmond City Council came who and participated in the March for Accountability. There was a former member of the city council who came, and he was actually the one, a former Democrat, right. a Democratic former member of the city council, black man. He was the one who made the point that you just made.
Exactly.
But none of the elected officials, Democrat nor Republican nor whatever they call themselves, came down and met with the people who were marching on Tuesday night. But let me tell you what did happen. When we got down to Shackled Bottom, after we marched, and it was actually, that was a longer march than one we went. it was his feet were hurting. I was like, why are we turning another corner? But it was a longer march than before. Once we got down to Shackled Bottom and we found out that the city council meeting was still going on, or that particular meeting was still going on to decide about this transit system, and a part of this light rail system was being proposed. Now, this all ties into the war on the poor. Now, the people in Richmond, especially our friends of the Virginia Defender and the Democratic Socialists of America down there, and other groups who have formed a coalition to fight together, hint, hint, progressives, they are fighting to stop the city of Richmond from building a part of a light rail system on the Shackled Bottom African burial ground.
Which is holy ground to us.
Which is absolutely holy ground to black people.
It's holy ground.
It is
it should actually be holy ground to America too.
It should be, but we know it's not. But remember, we said it in previous shows. We were down there, or live stream from there. Shackled Bottom, the burial ground at Shackled Bottom is the one place in Richmond. It was the only place in Richmond at one point where black people could legally be buried. It was the only place at one point where slaves could be buried. It was adjacent, and it is still adjacent, to the Lumpkins jail site. And the Lumpkins jail site was the entryway for slaves being brought to Richmond. So that entire area is holy ground to the history of Richmond, to the history of America, to the history of black people. But the City Council of Richmond, all of them, Democrat, Republican, black, white, all of them, all of the money-grubbing, greedy capitalists want to build a light rail station on a part of the area, and they wanted to build a stadium on the burial ground. Now we've got people opposing taking down the statues because they're saying that we just want to erase history. Well, building a stadium on a burial ground or building a light rail station on part of a burial ground, that's exactly what they're trying to do. But see, they're doing it because they don't want our history to be told. They would like for the people in Richmond to stop talking about that so that they can stop talking about the other issues those loud and angry people, those loud and angry poor people are talking about in Richmond. Because the beautiful thing in Richmond is it's not just black people. There are a lot of white people in Richmond who show up to support the take down the monuments and build up Shockoe Bottom and improve the schools effort. And they are so threatening. They are so threatening to the capitalists in the Richmond City Council that when they found out that we were not ending our march at Shockoe Bottom, but we were going to march over to the City Council meeting, they ended the meeting. Someone went ahead. Well, somebody was there. I think Anna Edwards was there. She and a few other people were testifying.
From the Virginia Defenders.
From the Anna Edwards, from the Virginia Defenders. A few other people were testifying. And a lot of lip service was given. And if you watch the video on our YouTube channel, go to Luqmans Nation on YouTube, and we will have the video published later on tonight. So you can see all of the speakers from that rally. And Anna Edwards, I think, is at the end.
Yes.
But before any of the speakers happened, we were marching down to the meeting.
Yep.
Because somebody told us, hey, when we got to the tunnel, hey, the meeting is still going on. Let's go in there and show them that we know what they're up to and they have to answer to us. This was poor people fighting for their rights and advocacy. This is what's happening in this country, in poor communities across this country. Small pockets of people, mostly black people, but a lot more white people are getting the idea that this is your fight too. Because see, the capitalists that are in power believe that if they say things like, look, we're providing transportation so that people can have access to jobs, then they can cover over the fact that they're really not providing access to transportation to the jobs where they exist and for the people who need that access the most, which are the poor people who live in the communities that they're trying to tear down and push out of the cities. That's what's really going on in Richmond. And that kind of thing is really going on in Washington, D.C. too. And if you have a poor community in your city, I guarantee you it's going on there too.
You know, one of the things that we spoke about, one of the things that came to my mind when I was speaking to my daughter, and without revealing too much, but if you come up in the hood, you know, you're going to know someone who's applied for Section 8. Mm-hmm. And Section 8 is the federal housing government subsidy program to help poor people obtain affordable housing, you know, somewhat affordable housing. It's rent subsidies. Mm-hmm. And if you grew up in the urban areas, I mean, you've heard these horror stories about people waiting on the waiting list for 10 years, 12 years. I mean, it's just unbelievable what poor people have to do to have shelter in this country, affordable shelter in this country. And so anyway, there, you know, Jackie, you got something that you're going to put up for us to show that Donald Trump, and it's before Donald Trump, so let me make that clear. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump did not create this mess. But what happened is that because he is president now, he is proposing in his budget to cut 68% from public housing funding that the federal government gives. Mm-hmm. this. You talk about trickle down effect. This trickles down to this is just going to make affordable housing worse in this country.
Mm-hmm.
The access to affordable housing worse.
Yeah.
So we have something on there.
Yeah. Let me find the statistic. Let me find. Oh, this is from this article in the Washington Post. Is this the one you mean?
The Washington Post, right? That's it.
Yeah. I'm putting up with this. I'm putting it up on the screen from you guys. This is actually a story about mismanagement, and mismanagement really isn't even the right word for it, because we've all heard of block grants, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, and everybody thinks that block grants are this great, wonderful thing, woohoo! But the problem with block grants is that there have to be oversight of how the money's spent, who spends it,
Mm-hmm.
and it has to be spent. The money must
right.
be spent, and it has to be spent on what it's allocated for, or else it goes back to the government. Well, in the District of Columbia, let me slide all the way back up to the beginning of this article so you can see what this is about. The DC Housing Department forfeited millions of dollars as families waited for help. Now, Washington, D.C. has a program called HOME, which is, let me see what it's called, what it stands for here. It's a housing production trust fund, and the money comes from the federal government, and it is supposed to be overseen by the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is the part of this problem that existed before Donald Trump.
Right.
Okay, because I think we need to be really careful that we're not laying this at the feet of Trump, and that we're making it clear that this is a problem with capitalism that is very frequently racialized.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the DC government, DC Department of Housing and Community Development, was forced to forfeit. They were forced to send it back $15.8 million in the past 3 years after repeatedly missing key spending deadlines.
Now, right there, because I want to put that in context.
Okay.
That this is during the time that DC have the highest increase in homeless families.
Yes.
Within decades.
Yes. And I think
I just want to make that clear.
Right. And we read somewhere what was like 24%.
Right.
Increase in homeless families.
Families, not individuals. Families.
Families. Okay. So the DC HUD for DC had to give back $15.8 million because they didn't spend money that was allocated for building affordable housing for poor people in the district. The spending problems predate the current administration, the Bowser administration, but most of the bills came due soon after she took office. No other housing agency in the country returned more affordable housing money to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development between 2014 and 2016 than the districts, which forfeited 22% of all the money that was sent back to HUD in the 3-year period, an analysis of federal data shows. Now, this sets up the whole Trump and the budget cuts thing.
Right.
The reason this is not entirely Trump's problem, and it's not entirely Obama's problem, but it is a problem of capitalistic greed, is because home funds are allocated to go to developers.
Exactly.
To build public housing. I know you don't believe me, so let me find it. Let me find it. Let me find the first one. The housing agency's director, this is HUD, Polly Donaldson, said that when she took over in 2015, the community and investment agency within HUD, the department had 40 vacancies, management issues, and a shortage of housing developers willing to take on home-funded projects.
So it's up to them whether they even want to do this or not, even though the money is allocated
Right.
for them to do this, but they don't see a profit in that.
Exactly. This is the thing. The federal government is giving money to developers to build affordable housing. And developers are saying, no, we won't take your money because we don't want to build affordable housing, because we want to charge as much money as we can for the housing that we are going to build.
And so when the money's not used, the government
It gets
wants it
sent back to the government. So this is where, let's see. This is where Trump comes in. President Trump's 2018 budget proposal calls for eliminating the home program, the entire program, part of $6 billion in potential cuts at the embattled federal agency, that's HUD, that is now headed by
Ben Carson,
who is completely in favor of
cutting all of this stuff.
Housing advocates, which neither Ben Carson nor Donald Trump nor honestly President Obama nor anybody else who has ever held any office
Since Nixon,
Nixon really are, none of those people are housing advocates, because if they were, we wouldn't have this problem.
Exactly.
Housing advocates in the district and across the country said the loss of that money would devastate communities that for years have successfully leveraged home funds. Whew, oh, that's right. There is something that we wanted to talk about in this article. There's a particular family that flies in the face of everybody's stereotypes
right. Exactly.
of
what the homeless
yeah. Let me bear with us, guys. This is this is too important to just kind of skip through. So a lot of people have this idea, let me get rid of that. A lot of people have this idea that people who are on Section 8 who get vouchers for housing, that's what Section 8 is, who get vouchers for affordable housing are, just a bunch of deadbeat single mothers who have a bunch of babies by a bunch of different baby daddies and a bunch of drug addicts, which, like we said, you can't get federal housing if you have a federal drug conviction. Right. So that's impossible. But these are the kinds of people in the district who are faced with this issue. The district housing department was forced to return millions in home dollars. Even as the homeless population soared, just like we said, more and more families moved into shelters, and the waiting list for rent vouchers remained closed to new households. More families were made homeless, and there were no more vouchers. They only distributed 100 vouchers every year, even though they have all of these billions of dollars in federal funds. But the people who were allegedly overseeing this program didn't do what other cities did and use those funds to pay for rent vouchers. Right. It's just, we're going to give you a link to this article so you can read it yourself. It's too much to go through. Anyway, okay. Nearly 40,000 families are waiting for vouchers. Those near the top of the list signed up well over a decade ago.
And that is common. You go through Camden, DC, any urban area, and you will hear these horror stories of people who signed up for housing vouchers like 15 years ago.
Yes.
And it might, I have family members that have experienced that stuff.
Yep.
I mean, my mother, when we were kids, man, I remember her signing up for Section 8. She never got it because she was too far on the list. By the time her name came up, she couldn't get it because we were grown and out the house.
Right. So here's one particular family. This is directly from the article. My kids say, "Mommy, what's wrong? Are we going to be homeless?" said 31-year-old Carolyn Harrison, who took 3 buses to a $10.75 an hour cashier's job in Maryland before losing the position. She worked at the time.
Took
Not a
3
deadbeat.
buses.
Took 3
And
buses.
if anybody who lives in this area know that this area has one of the highest fares.
Yes.
When it comes to
transportation. You know what else this area has that's an exorbitant cost that's higher than anywhere else in the country that kills working people? Childcare.
Wow.
Childcare in the district is the most expensive childcare in the country, but that's another show. So it goes on to say, though her husband works nights in a residential... What?
You said a husband.
Yes, she has one of those.
Wow, so this just not, this ain't Tamika with
no, this is not Shaniqua and her 8 kids by 6 different baby daddies. This is a woman who had a job, who was doing everything she could to keep that $10.75 an hour job out in Maryland, because we don't pronounce our A's in DC, out in Maryland. She has a husband. And her husband works nights in a residential facility for veterans. The couple can only afford a $300 a month unit subsidized by a homeless prevention nonprofit group.
Not the government.
Not the government, a nonprofit group. Even though this agency had $17 billion
wow.
that developers didn't want to take to build housing for people like Mrs. Harrison.
Right.
And her family, and her husband and her family. Because they can't charge Mrs. Harrison $3,000 a month.
Right.
For rent. Now the lease is up and Harrison doesn't know where she and her husband will go. With their 3 young children, she has been waiting for a voucher for nearly 10 years. This is what she says. I'm not looking for anyone to do it for me. I'm just looking for guidance and assistance to get my life back on track for my kids.
Something tells me, and maybe I might be out of line for this, but when we hear these type of stories, something tells me that if we were to change the face of these people to white, it would garner more sympathy. And the reason why I say that, because we know that Tim Wise had brought this up, and we've seen this in plenty of times before, that we know that poverty has been racialized.
Right.
This has been racialized. Prior to when during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, when you had poor white farmers fleeing from the Dust Bowl, and they entered cities, and then the Great Depression came, and poverty was looked at as, why they down on it. Look what happened. It's not any fault of theirs.
Right, and they need help.
And government intervention came in, and then as soon as poverty became racialized, then you have all of this. Well, we need welfare recipients to take drug tests. We need all of these punitive measures was put in place. And then all of a sudden now the poor became demonized. Right. The poor wasn't demonized when the face of the poor people were white. When poverty and white folks went together, it wasn't this demonization of the poor. Now that poverty is looked at as a black and brown problem mainly, and I say this to say that this is one of the reasons why poor people, black and brown poor people, have no allies. Because no matter, we can sit back and be sad all we want. We could cry and talk about how it's a shame, but deep inside of a lot of us, it doesn't garner the same type of empathy because poverty has been racialized.
Right. Exactly.
The fact that we have to sit here and emphasize that this woman, Mrs. Harrison, is a Mrs. And that her husband works at night, we have to qualify them.
Right.
We have to qualify them. This is what our society has become when it comes to black and poor people.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up. That Mrs. Harrison has to be she and her family, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, have to be qualified. In order for some people, not many of our friends and viewers in Luqman Nation, but other people who will see this video afterward outside of Luqman Nation and need to look at these people as people. Because the reason this has been allowed to get this far, this bad for this long, is because middle class folks, black and white, but many white people honestly do not look at the poor as people. And some of the conversations we've had, not only with white people, but some of the conversations we've had with some middle class black people just really reinforces that idea that once we feel a little financially comfortable, like, we don't have to eat beans every day anymore, and we can afford, to choose what we want to eat, and we think we can afford to choose where we want to live. We think we can afford that, but we can choose that, but we really don't. Not if we're black.
Yeah,
we look down on people who are still where we used to be, but it remains, like we've always said, the reason white supremacy still exists and still works is because most of the white voters in this country continue to vote for racist policies.
yeah, and stupid black Christians too.
We will get to that.
But see, the thing of it is that, and when we say that, and I'm glad, Jackie, that you qualified that about, that this is not just a white problem, because white supremacy isn't about your skin color.
Right.
White supremacy is about what you think and what you believe and how you perceive the world around you. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, you have a lot of black people who have been affected with the disease of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And so, no, it's when we call it white supremacy, we're talking about an ideology, not what you look like.
Right.
A belief system.
Right.
How you perceive the world around you. The other thing is that when we wanted to go to, mm-hmm, is the fact that when you look at people like the Harrisons, mm-hmm, right, mm-hmm, and you look at what we've seen in Richmond and all of this stuff. And it's easy for people to sit back, because see, one of the things I wanted to ask is, what would you tell Mr. and Mrs. Harrison if you were to give them advice? Because see, time and time again, black people who have been in this position have always been told, well, if you just went to college, or, mm-hmm, well, if you didn't have any, mm-hmm, children, or, mm-hmm, well, if you would have made better decisions. You know why all of that is bullshit? I broke the rule for cussing today.
You did. It wasn't me this time.
But you know why it's all bullshit? Because there's another article that's been written out, and we're going to look at that as our last item for the day, that the government, yes, our beloved government, the ones that, people are getting mad because people don't want to stand up for the flag and stuff like that, our beloved government has been in cahoots with financial institutions, mm-hmm, to deny and block black people from the so-called American dream. You have that article, right?
Yep, I do have that article, and this time I'm queued up to the exact spot. This history, because this is what it is, and like I said, we're going to give you these links to this article. This is history. This is what our government actually has done. And there are still practices today in the real estate industry that are still racialized, that are a legacy of this history. So this is why I have no patience with people with the conspiracy theories, and it's George Soros, and it's the Illuminati. None of that was necessary for the government to do this.
Nope.
None of that. So what did the government do? All right, so this is from Splinter News. And the article is how the U.S. government locked black Americans out of home ownership. So the question is, okay, let's talk about the flip side of that, racial inclusion. How historically middle-class white people were included in these sweeping government programs that were maybe not targeted for white people, but black people were excluded from them when they were implemented. And what is that if that's not a handout? White people got that from the government, and that's why the GI Bill, the FHA, mm-hmm, programs, they were nothing but big government handouts to the white middle class in this country. Sweeping government programs that help them get a business loan, get a college education, the education portion of the GI Bill, get a house, the mortgage portion of the GI Bill. I feel like that's something that gets left out of the conversation, is delineating how many sweeping government programs there have been with the express purpose of building up white wealth. And the person who's being interviewed says this. This is the history. Go ahead. You were going to say something?
Well, I was going to say before, everybody think this is biased. This is actually a white woman who wrote this article.
Oh, thank you for pointing that out. Thank you for pointing that out.
She did all this research.
Yeah, and there are a couple of other articles that convey this same history, all written by white people, that we are going to share with you too. Because sometimes we know that some white people just think that black people just make stuff up,
or they dismiss it if somehow Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote it.
Right? Yeah. So we're not going to share the case for reparations with you again. We'll share these written by white people. So the interviewer says, to the extent that white Americans became middle class, it is through the credit infrastructure that was bolstered and sponsored by the federal government starting in 1934. We're not even talking about slavery right now. They talked about slavery in the paragraphs before this one. That's why I intentionally didn't start with that. 1934. There are all of these agencies and programs: the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the Federal Housing Administration, the FDIC insurance program that loosened up credit and capital. All of a sudden, mortgage credit was abundant. Anyone could get mortgage credit. Blue-collar workers could afford a mortgage. A mortgage became much more affordable than renting in the city, so they all moved out to the suburbs. The most important distinction for who could get these mortgages or not was race. They mapped out the country through racial zones. This was explicit through government programs. The government denied black people the opportunity to own homes. The government denied black people the opportunity to access capital. The government denied black people the opportunity to access credit. The government owes black people, period, end of story.
Exactly.
But this nice white lady goes on to say, this created the white suburbs and created generational prosperity. But there's the flip side.
There's the dark side.
And this is why politics and policy ties into the fight, the battle, the war against the poor that's racialized. Because these policies also created the ghetto. The wealth gap existed before then because of Jim Crow and segregation. But in the 20th century, these government credit facilities cemented the wealth gap for our generation.
Basically put the nail in the coffin.
Yep. Even because white people will always come back with, well, we've got the Civil Rights Act and affirmative action. Even as we have the Civil Rights era and the Civil Rights Act outlaws de jure Jim Crow. That is Jim Crow by law. It outlaws the legislation. All of these economic cycles and processes remain intact.
So it's just not, you don't have the signs anymore.
That's de facto Jim Crow. It is in practice. It might not be a law, but it sure is still done.
The way that business is still being done.
Yes. So we're going to give you a link to this. We're not going to read the whole article to you, but listen, when we talk about a war on the poor, when we talk about a war on the black poor, that's not hyperbole. That's not, we're just being dramatic. Oh my God, the black people are being dramatic again. No. This is what was done. And this was what was intentionally done. So this is the fight that poor black people, but poor black people in particular, have been fighting against our government that has done these things to us out in the open. The Illuminati didn't do this. George Soros didn't do it. The Rothschilds didn't do it. None of this was a false flag. None of this was done as a distraction to take anybody's attention away. No, this was done out in the open by the government, and it is still being done today.
And it's being done because this country was founded by people who never intended to include us in this society.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have a government that still practice that still commit those type of practices to financially disenfranchise people, then that is a government telling you that we don't want you to be a part of the success in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reason why we bring this information, because the narrative has always been blacks are lazy. I mean, so much so, white supremacy is funny because white supremacy will have the victims blaming themselves.
Right.
So
right.
what happens is that you'll have people who look like me who come from other countries talking about, well, what's wrong with you black Americans? Why couldn't y'all do it? Why can't y'all get out the ghetto?
Mm-hmm.
Or why is it that, the Jews and the Asians, y'all love to point to the Asians, and how the Asians, they come here and they just work so hard and get out of it. You know why? Because unlike the Asians, unlike the Jews, unlike everybody else who came here, we had to fight our own government.
Oh my God,
to
that's
even
perfect.
belong here and gain the benefits of which our ancestors have fought to establish.
Right. And this is why, man, that just left like a really, ooh, that aroma is just like amazing right now. We're the only group of people who had to fight our own government to belong here. I mean, other groups of people were discriminated against when they came here. Yes, they were. Other group of people were oppressed when they came here. Absolutely, they were. But at some point, the government let up off them. What we just talked about, specifically in housing, only in housing, it wasn't targeted at Asians, although Asians were caught up in it some.
But let me add a footnote to that.
Okay.
That in 1934 there was not a single immigrant, there was not a single European ethnic group that wasn't already assimilated in this country by 1934.
Thank you.
This had already came after the large waves from Ellis Island and all this other kind of stuff.
Yes.
So much so that in 1934 you have first generation Europeans already benefiting.
Dang it, out of time, because that. So so you do know there's going to be a part 2, right? Because that it just the fact that we've had to fight our own government just to belong, just to have access, just for equal access, and first generation immigrants were able to come to this country and benefit from programs that simultaneously excluded us from accessing the American dream. So when I have conversations with people online and in person about things like poor people who are overweight need to focus on changing their diet, no, screw you. No, I'm not concerned with what people put in their mouths. That's something that y'all can deal with that on your own time. You know what poor people need? Poor people need the government to cut that check. Just like Martin Luther King Jr. said. Martin Luther King Jr. said that when they were going to Washington, D.C., or coming to Washington, D.C. for the Poor People's Campaign, you know what he said they were coming for? We're coming to Washington, D.C. because the government owes us a check. We coming to get our check. So this is why we fight. We don't fight to tell people how to change their personal preferences for their life. We're fighting a system of government, an ideology of white supremacy that uses the government to continue to oppress a specific group of people, but it also affects everybody else too. So,
So this segues into this special presentation.
It does,
because as you know, we're going to Baltimore.
We are
because we want to. Jackie said 3 years ago, Baltimore brought all of this stuff into the national conversation. And so we're going back to Baltimore to carry on this conversation, because the media trucks aren't there anymore. It's not a sexy story anymore. Everybody that moved on to whatever they moved on to. But guess what? Those stories need to be told. And so we are going to present today.
Yep, we're ready.
We're ready?
Yes,
okay.
we are.
This is our promo for our new documentary, Baltimore After the Fire. And look, without much further ado, I don't know.
Well, we do need to tell people to follow us on YouTube.
Right.
Subscribe to us on YouTube, Luqmans Nation.
There you go.
Like us on Facebook. Share our videos. Hit us up on Patreon, Patreon Luqmans Nation, and consider becoming a patron to support this effort that you are about to get the very first sneak peek of. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Peace. Be really good to each other.
Baltimore is burning, but as the fires continue to burn, people here left asking if the police have done enough and whether this violence is really about the death of 25-year-old Freddie Gray.
It has been a night of chaos, violence, lawlessness in Baltimore over the death of Freddie Gray.
Right now, the National Guard is on the scene trying to restore peace. And as we said, all public schools are closed today.
On Sunday, April 12th, Gray was taken into police custody. The arrest once again captured by a bystander's cell phone.
Hey, that boy leg look gross.
Gray seemingly in pain and screaming, unable to walk, as officers drag him into a transport van. Reportedly, when he arrived at the police station a half hour later, he was unable to breathe or talk. Medics rushed him to the hospital. A few days later, he slipped into a coma and then later died from a severe spinal injury.
Baltimore's poverty rate is nearly double the national average.
The unemployment rate among young African-American men hovers around 30%.
High school graduation rates for black males are devastatingly low.
A lack of access to labor markets, healthcare, housing.
It has chronic severe drug and crime issues.
One of the highest violent crime rates in America.
Since 2011, the city of Baltimore has paid out close to $6 million in court judgments or settlements to victims of police abuse.
So far, there have been more questions than answers regarding his death. It's still unclear why Gray was arrested. According to the police report, Gray fled unprovoked upon noticing police presence.
This has been our response to communities asking for resources. Law enforcement has essentially become a surrogate for